Welcome, everybody. My name is Carly Graham Garcia. I'm the Executive Director of the Feliciano Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Montclair State University. And I am pleased to welcome Eve Schaenen, the Executive Director of the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center. Full caveat for those listening, Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center is on Montclair State University's campus. Eve did not start the museum or learning center, but she has been instrumental in implementing entrepreneurial ideas and ways of communicating the values of Yogi Berra and also the STEM-focused learning tools to student groups and other tour groups that visit the museum and learning center every year. So Eve, welcome. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
Absolutely, I'm thrilled to be here.
So before we get started, tell our viewers, especially our international students and partners, what the museum is and also who Yogi Berra was.
Absolutely. Well, Yogi Berra was, the simple answer is, he was a great baseball player, a Hall of Fame baseball player, a catcher, most famously for the New York Yankees. He really anchored the New York Yankees dynasty from the mid-40s when he came up in the game to the early 1960s when he left the Yankees. And that was when the Yankees, you know, New York City was the beating heart of the baseball world, and the Yankees won 10 championships with Yogi. So, so sort of the easy answer is he was a great baseball player. There are a lot of great baseball players that don't have museums dedicated to them. So the next follow-up is sort of like, but why? And I think the other thing about Yogi Berra is he really does encapsulate a kind of American story, a story of our country that allows us to then do all kinds of interesting storytelling at the museum. You know, I mean, I always feel like there's a great quote by David Halberstam, the great journalist and sports writer, who says, you know, behind every great sports story is the story of a nation. And I think we could sort of say the same thing about Yogi. Behind Yogi's story is an immigration story because his parents came from Italy. There is a, you know, a military history story. He served in World War II at D-Day, sort of the most iconic battle of the war. You know, and certainly throughout the 50s and 60s, there's, you know, a civil rights story because he was playing baseball when baseball was integrated. He played against and with Jackie Robinson, you know, so he really is one of those figures that allows us, you know, almost like a lens to widen the view and introduce visitors, and particularly young visitors and students, to a world of storytelling and lessons that I think are very important and we really need now more than ever.
That's great. So since your arrival at the museum in 2016, when we met, you had mentioned really leaning into the learning center component. Talk a little bit about sort of how you've taken this space and using kind of your entrepreneurial skills, brought some of the learning components forward. Tell us more about sort of being entrepreneurial in a cultural institution.
Sure. One of the things that is really great about working for a museum with Yogi Berra's name on it is everybody loves Yogi. This is what I have learned. Whether they knew him personally, and lots of people encountered him personally because he was famously accessible, raised his family here in Montclair, so local folks knew him, you know, but you go anywhere in America and it doesn't matter if they loved the Yankees or hated the Yankees, everybody loved Yogi. He was sort of one of the original branded personalities. He himself was quite entrepreneurial in that way, you know, whether it was Yoo-Hoo chocolate drink or Aflac, you know, insurance, people knew who Yogi was. And as a result, that's made me quite brave and to sort of ask people, right, that old, you know, the old adage, you know, if you're going to pray for something, pray out loud. And as a nonprofit, everything we do is funded by donor dollars. So, you know, in order to expand the learning piece of our education center, I started asking people to get engaged and get involved. And because all the work is driven by Yogi's values, you know, leading with respect and teamwork, anyone in business knows if you're not promoting those values, you know, you're not going to succeed. So, you know, to make the case that we were really sustaining those ideas of collaboration, teamwork, perseverance, excellence, you name it. It sounds like any corporation's mission statement, and it happens to be the goals driving the museum. So, you know, a perfect example was one of the first things I wanted to introduce was some kind of interactive experience at the museum. We have these beautiful artifacts from Yogi's career. They're behind glass. lovers of the game love them and could stare at them for hours, right? World Series rings are beautiful, and Yogi's got 10 of them. But I think, especially for young people, and frankly, for lots of museum goers today, a museum experience, there's an expectation now of some interactivity. So I wanted to do some kind of tech-driven interactive, and I reached out to the folks that make all the radar guns for all of the major league ballparks, Stalker Radar, and said, come visit our museum. You know, of course, they love Yogi, they love baseball. And after a visit and a tour and a description of what we're doing, I asked them to donate the tech that would allow us to create this experience around it. So out of that came this interactive sort of digitized pitching game where anyone can throw a real ball in real time, see how fast they throw it, measure the accuracy of the pitch. It also lets us teach kids, you know, critically important STEM lessons, you know, the physics of baseball, the kinetic transfer of energy, you know, what it means, what stride is, what distance is, what velocity is, trajectory, all those terms, and it's super fun. So, you know, that's where like sort of all the pieces come together. And I think once the folks at Stalker Radar saw that, we had kind of a proof of concept, and I could approach other folks and say, look, you're going to want to get involved with us because look at what we're going to do with this. We're going to turn this around into a really fun, engaging learning opportunity. And these are going to be the young people in the STEM fields who are going to take jobs and help you, you know, do what you need to do in the future.
Yeah, that's great. So you just touched on a couple of things I wanted to ask you. And one of the, so going first back to what you said about putting a prayer. So we say a lot at the Entrepreneurship Center, we quote the performer Drake, who talks a lot. He has a great quote, basically says, you know, I say a prayer. I'm the type of person that says a prayer and then I go get what I just prayed for. So you just sort of, you know, echoed something that we say a lot here on campus. But a couple of things. So on your website, you actually have an entire section dedicated to yogiism, which I love. And those encapsulate a lot of the themes you just talked about: positive thinking, resilience, humor also, which I think is really needed in this moment. So I love that you highlighted some of those core tenets that he believed in because they're front and center on your website, which I think is really cool and important. You talked about STEM education, and one of the things I wanted to ask you, especially given, you know, baseball in America and in many other places around the world is a male sport. There were some really interesting piece of news, and I'm going to quote her name, Alyssa Nakin, who made news just last week that she was going to be the first woman to coach an MLB team, Major League Baseball here in the States, on the field during a major league game. And so I mentioned her because, you know, this series is about women entrepreneurship. So what you just explained that visitors can learn around STEM clearly is applicable to both young girls and young boys. But tell us more about how, you know, visiting the Museum and Learning Center of a baseball great who was male, how young women can be inspired by him.
Happily. I think, you know, one of the first things when I got to the museum that I had to sort of, you know, make plain to the board and to, you know, and to the whole team that we work with is, if we were actually going to remain relevant and not just sort of survive the death of Yogi Berra in 2015, but really thrive and expand, we were going to have to widen the lens again. I sort of referred to that earlier. And that included maybe stepping back from kind of the cult of personality around Yogi. And believe me, there's reason to, you know, devote yourself to that cult because he was such a phenomenal person. And look at the larger picture, the larger systems in which he played. And certainly systems of discrimination. I mean, this is the conversation that we're having as a country right now. And thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, people are starting to really understand what that means and unpack that in all kinds of new ways. And I think, you know, vis-a-vis young women in sports, similarly, we knew that sports is one of the arenas where discrimination and inequity is writ large, right? You know, why aren't women playing baseball? You know, how did that come about? If you look at the history of it, it's not, you know, there are a lot of myths around why that is. The ball's too hard, they can't throw overhand. And yet during World War II, when Yogi was in the Navy and other ball players were overseas, well, I don't know if you saw the great film A League of Their Own, but if we all know Gina Davis and Madonna, that's a true story. Women were playing baseball when the men were overseas. Why? Because it was smart business, right? So, you know, I mean, again, you know, there's no innate reason why they couldn't. And then again, it was a business decision that they no longer played when the men returned. But I do think that sports can allow us to sort of look at those systems in a way that it's maybe, harder to do, in a larger societal way, because it becomes so clear. I mean, you mentioned, the very first woman on a major league ball field as, coaching, she came from the world of softball. That's another case where, out of Title IX, softball came up. Softball is a great sport, but it's great for men and women. There's no reason why girls need to be channeled into softball and away from baseball, except to preserve a kind of male space for baseball. So I think, again, people are going to be looking at these systems in a deeper way. And as a museum, we're trying to do everything we can to encourage that kind of deeper thinking, critical thinking around those topics. We have an online curriculum about gender in sports, where we really look hard at the history of baseball and the role of women in baseball. So, I think that, it's another way in which, yes, Yogi was white. Yes, he was male. Yes, he was playing in a white male dominated sport. There's no reason why we can't look at the bigger picture around him and see who wasn't playing, right?
Yeah.
And what were those reasons? And what were those reasons in the 1940s and 50s and 60s? And what's keeping people from doing it today?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer, and that makes a ton of sense. You touched on something I want to make sure that we talk more about, really around sort of the reckoning that we are having around race and racial inequality right now in this country and in around the world. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement that you mentioned sparked protests and outrage globally. So we're not unique in that here in the States. You already had been planning to celebrate and profile the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues here in the States. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you thought about that work beforehand, before COVID, and now how you're thinking about it being that much more important in the moment that we're in now?
Absolutely. I actually, it's so corny. I mean, I sort of get shivers when I think about how this whole thing evolved, because, we knew that 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues, the founding of the Negro Leagues by Rube Foster in Kansas City. And my feeling was, as a baseball museum, again, with that eye toward widening the lens, making us more inclusive, more accessible, more engaging to more people, I wanted to tell part of that story, right? We're a baseball museum. How can we not tell the story of the Negro Leagues? It is a critical chapter in the history of baseball. And sadly, often neglected. One of the other things that came out is we would have young people visit the museum. We have images of Jackie Robinson on the walls of our museum because he was, a Brooklyn Dodger and Yogi's great rival. And when we ask kids, who this person is, more often than not, they would say, Jackie Robinson was the first Black baseball player. And there was always that moment of pause where we would have to correct and say, no, there was a world of Black ball players. Jackie Robinson was the first Black ball player to play in the major leagues, right? So, it made me feel like this is a piece of baseball history and frankly, a piece of American heritage that is not being transmitted in the schools. And we need to tell that story. So I actually got on a plane with some of the folks in my education team, and we flew to Kansas City, which is the home of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and met with the director there, Bob Kendrick, who was a remarkable figure. And I just basically said to Bob, we need to do something about the story at the Yogi Berra Museum. Anyway, we ended up borrowing one of their traveling exhibits, and we built a lot of programming around that exhibit. This launched, we opened it to the public in September of 2019 because I wanted to have the full academic year. We all know what happened since then, right? So we had already had tons of young people come through the museum, not just young people, visitors. I mean, the numbers went through the roof because the Negro League story is also a local story for us in Montclair, New Jersey, in this part of the country. There were major Negro League teams in Newark, stars coming out of Patterson. These are the towns that are all around us. So we had some great, sort of personal connection, from the folks that came through. But again, we wanted to launch a really engaging education program, which we did. Okay, that happens March 13th. Like so many other cultural institutions, we have to close our doors. But we had already done quite a bit of online work. And so our team was pretty quickly able to pivot the program that we had created to an online virtual experience. We ended up offering the Negro Leagues program as a virtual field trip to schools.
Cool.
And it took us about a month to do that. I would say from, the end of April until the end of the school year in June, we had over 1,700 students come through our virtual field trip. I mean, it was just, we couldn't keep up. I mean, we were running a couple of trips a day. And it just spoke to the need because, of course, in the course of those months, the civil unrest in the streets, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all of those, I mean, all of that came to a head. And really more than anything, we found that young people were desperate for an opportunity to talk about some of what was going on, to process it.
Yeah.
Other piece of it, right? You have the history, which was important and that we needed to share. And as much as anything, we also needed to create a safe space where kids could have a conversation about what they were experiencing and what they were feeling. And that has always been, a priority for me. I believe in sharing history to inform what's going on today and choices we make for the future. And I think that, that's what we've been able to do. And I'm proud of that work. And I really do feel like, it's only going to get bigger. I mean, we have since, pulled together an advisory board of educators, talking about undoing racism, anti-racist agendas, how we can build that more into the curriculum, how we can use the exhibit's called Discover Greatness, an illustrated history of the Negro Leagues. We now have it available as an exhibit virtually on our website because I wanted everyone to be able to see it. So, that's one of those things where, we had no idea when we got on that plane to go to Kansas City in the summer of 2019 what would end up happening. But, as it played out, it feels like work that is ongoing and we will continue to really just expand on and develop.
That's great. And so just remind folks how they can find Discover Greatness and also the virtual exhibits. I love on your website, you say that you're now open 24/7. Remind our viewers of your website and the best way for them to engage or schedule a virtual tour.
Sure. You can find us at yogiberramuseum.org. On our homepage, you can find links to our virtual education programs. The virtual exhibit itself, the Negro Leagues exhibit, is there. You can click through it. We had commissioned an augmented reality experience at the museum that allowed some of these black and white photographs of these not famous, but phenomenally great Negro League players for you to be able to see them in color. And we really wanted to translate that experience to the website. You can now do that by clicking through. It just brings them to this kind of vivid life in a way that the black and white photos don't do them justice. That's on the website. Links to the education department, to the field trips, all of it. It's all there. And we laugh, about the sign that says we're open 24/7, but we're really open 24/7. As we're also hosting virtual events to connect community. I'm leaving this Zoom call and heading over to do online bingo night, which we've been doing every week. It's just, whatever it takes to get people connected around Yogi's legacy, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with the limited amount of time we have left, Eve, I wanted to talk specifically about your entrepreneurialism and what you've brought to the Museum and Learning Center. You have a really diverse and sort of rich background of working with nonprofits, culture, Aerospace, Intrepid. You've worked at other, major institutions. You have had, to use your own words, to use my words, you've been scrappy, but to use your words, you've been reliant just on the limited funding that you have from your supporters. So you talked a little bit about pitch, where folks can actually, experience sort of what it's like to throw out a ball and the STEM engagement around it. How have you been sort of scrappy and entrepreneurial with what you've got? I mean, give some advice to folks who maybe are thinking about actually building a space like yours. How do you do it on a shoestring budget?
I think, my biography is all over the map. But, when I think about it, there's kind of, a thread running through it, if you will. It really focuses on storytelling. I was a journalist before I did this. I worked for the New York Times. I worked for NBC News. That idea of sort of pulling together various pieces and creating a narrative that people can connect to and relate to, I've always done that. And I would argue that museum work, especially today, is really another form of storytelling. And so, what I find, as an entrepreneur, you got to sell your story, right? It's not unlike that. What's always fascinating me about storytelling is that idea that it is this kind of really the most ancient practice that connects us as people, whether it's, people sitting around a fire, 10,000 years ago, telling stories of the hunt, or, a podcast today, or, a TikTok clip of 15 seconds. These are all versions of sort of getting people to connect to what you're doing through some form of narrative. It doesn't have to be linear. It can be visual. It can be multimedia. There's all kinds of ways to do it. And I have found that storytelling is what has allowed me to sort of make the case to funders, whether it was Siemens Corporation, who are working with us to create a computer animated design curriculum about sports. And that gets back to my, we got to find a way to teach young people STEM, young women STEM, young people of color STEM. There's a huge opportunity gap there. We want to fill it. So I spoke to Siemens about that, and they're on board and gave us a grant to promote that kind of work. Or foundations, or the Council for the Humanities. It really always comes down to really making a compelling story. And because that is, as everyone knows, that's what's going to get people to buy in. Right? That's what's going to get people to become engaged. I think it's really hard to do so unless you're able to do that. So, as far as advice goes, I really do feel like the best thing to do is get good at listening to stories, listen for the good ones and try and figure out what makes them good. Because those I find, it goes back to my major as a history and literature, specialist in college, when everyone said, what are you going to do with that degree? And I feel like I find myself pulling those skills out all the time, right? What makes people, ask another question, ask a follow-up, want to hear more? It's because you told a good story. So that's my advice.
Yeah, that is great advice. So for the young woman out there thinking of, proposing and building the Simone Biles Museum and Learning Center in 2040, take that storytelling advice to heart. That's excellent. Last question, Eve, and then we'll let you go. What's next for the brand, for the Yogi Berra brand, and for the Museum and Learning Center? What's your hope for the next stage when we come out of this, which we will?
Yes, we will. That said, I feel like one of our great strengths is that we're kind of lean and mean and nimble. It has allowed us to pivot into this most recent crisis. It has allowed us to modify and switch gears quickly so that we could accommodate and really support school districts, at-home educators, parents who are finding themselves with kids who are climbing the walls, seniors who are isolated at home and don't know what to do. So, I'm saying to my team, we're going to be ready for all of it. Here's what we know: the values that drive our mission, right? Perseverance, teamwork, again, respect. I'm sorry, I keep going back to them, but I feel like that's it, right? That's what it's about. That's what's going to get us through this crisis. It's what's going to get us through anything else in the future. And as long as we're tying our programming directly to that, I believe that people will understand the need, and we're getting the support that we need in order to fulfill the mission. So I'm hopeful. I feel like we're just going to grow. I know, the prospects are dire for cultures out there, but, just by example, the spring that we had and really the response that we had from the community, the work that we're doing makes me think we're just, we're going to keep on going until we zero out. That's the plan.
Okay, well, we wish you the best of luck. Eve Schaenen, Executive Director, Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Carla. It was great.